For over 10 years, we at Climate One have been engaging policymakers, influencers, entrepreneurs, and activists and scientists in broad, respectful, candid conversations about everything climate. Food, energy, water, technology, transportation, housing. We've had huge success bringing together people who think they're on opposite sides of issues. When they sit down and have a candid conversation, they often find common ground and the basis for real solutions. We're emotional beings. Thoughtful, inclusive conversations create the conditions in which the changes we want to see become possible. So I want to hear from you. When you talk about climate, how do you talk about it? More importantly, what do you want to be talking about? With whom? Join the conversation. Even make your own video. Invite your friends to join you. Let's talk climate. A lot of big companies, Tyson invested it in Memphis, Cargill, even Hormel, maker of Spam, is looking at this kind of thing. Is this where meat is going, away from the pasture to the lab?
Yeah, actually, I got interested in the story in part because I was writing about Tyson for Bloomberg, and I found that they were investing in Memphis Meats. Cargill Meats had come in, I think, first, and then brought, Tyson came in thereafter. A number of, sort of more predictable investors had also come in, Bill Gates and Richard Branson and so on. But I thought this was fascinating that the conventional meat industry was investing in sort of disruptive technologies, and asked Tom Hayes, who was then the CEO of Tyson, why are you going into cultured meats, or, aka cell-based meats or lab meats? And they said, he said, if you can grow the meat without the animal, why wouldn't we do that? There's a huge, resource advantage for us, and obviously ethical advantages to growing the meat without the animal. And he said, we see disruption in the auto industry, we see disruption in tobacco. Disruption is coming in the meats industry. That fascinated me, that this was, something that conventional meats were investing in. Now, granted, it's a small, fraction of what they're investing in conventional production methods, but the conversation is starting.
A lot of that is driven by the ability to lock up intellectual property, which businesses investors like to kind of put a moat around their investment so new competitors can't come in. Twilight Greenaway, does this idea of lab meat or industrial, does that fascinate or horrify you?
A little bit of both, I think, like a lot of Americans. I recently was thinking about this issue, actually, when the announcement was made. Tyson decided to do an end run. It looked like they were going to be, really, for the most part, putting their money into existing companies, and then they kind of decided to put their own products out. That was announced last week. And at the time, I was thinking about a conversation that had happened years ago about this idea of an organic Twinkie. And I don't know if any of you remember that.
Organic Twinkie.
Yeah, so
okay.
There was a discussion of, now that organic is having this groundswell, what will it mean when there is organic junk food, basically? There will be the benefit on the one end, there'll be there's a lot to say about changing practices on the land and what organic means in terms of pesticides and other environmental benefits, but on the other hand, you'll still end up with a Twinkie. And I think that that discussion felt very apt when I started to think about cell-based meat, because, cell-based meat, plant-based meat, and the investment and the huge kind of groundswell around seeing it as the solution. And I think there are obvious benefits. There are also some downsides. And so for me, it feels very similar. One of the main questions I have is about the ingredients that go into that, particularly the plant-based meat. How will it be raised? Will it be regenerative on a large scale? I think it was it Impossible that just came out declaring their pride at using American genetically modified soy. So I do think that it's very complicated, and I'm curious to see how it plays out.
So, Amanda, your response. I mean, GMOs. There are a lot of people on the left are rabidly against them. Other people say, well, there's cell editing. There's all sorts of techniques here. But really, what we're talking about is kind of the role of innovation and technology in food. Whether food ought to kind of be like our grandparents, or a product that's engineered and designed to address the hunger and climate challenges we're facing.
Yeah, and I'm interested to get to the GMO topic. With the lab-based or the cell-based meats, it's interesting because some of the claims, the potential is so exciting that there actually could be health benefits. There are many of these cell-based companies that are emerging, and so Memphis is only one of them. But the Uma Valetti, the founder, who is a cardiologist by training, was interested in potentially, the human health benefits of bringing in healthy fats, also addressing some of the contamination problems in meats, that this would actually do more than sort of what an organic Twinkie would do. It could create a lot more safety for the eaters of the meats, and certainly offset, of course, the impacts on the animals themselves. So in theory, it's really exciting. Certainly, what is the medium in which the cells are grown? What is the cost of this from an energy standpoint? How great are the potential climate benefits? A lot of that we don't yet know, but in concept, it's exciting. And this is what's so interesting about a lot of these areas of food tech, or what they call climate smart agriculture, that are emerging. There are the risks, the benefits. Meats, and on a small farm, he uses managed grazing, rotational grazing, and he basically said, the challenge is that what I produce on a small scale is not affordable for my neighbors. So who am I to begrudge some of these sustainable approaches that can produce cheap meat sustainably, with better human health and environmental impacts, if we can't all necessarily go to craft meats? What is the solution for a middle and low income meat eater? And so it was his interest in this as a potential solution for sort of the mass produced meats, not necessarily as an alternative to craft meats, but
I think that's my prediction, is that ultimately this is going to be what's in our fast food. It's not necessarily going to be I think there will always be a grass-fed steak available to the elites.
And that's what I think the folks who are in this area are saying too. I mean, they don't see this, completely offsetting. I think actually Pat Brown of Impossible Foods has said there will be no animal-derived meats by 2035 or something. He's made some pretty dramatic claims that
that's his wish.
That's right. I don't know that is shared by everyone in the alternative meats industry, but it is pretty extraordinary how far things have come. I mean, to see the Impossible Food product now adopted in Burger Kings and White Castles and Shake Shacks and so on, when 3-4 years ago people were saying, will mainstream consumers go for the veggie burger that bleeds with synthetic animal blood? This seems so far-fetched. The fact that we're seeing these ideas that had seemed far-fetched, get embraced and adopted pretty rapidly is surprising to me. Again, exactly what the benefits are and how these industries are managed is another question.
But Amanda, you mentioned, kind of the small, iconic American rancher. If meat is produced in a laboratory owned by a large corporation that is serving institutional shareholders, doesn't that just wipe out the, small-scale cattle rancher?
No,
consolidate
I don't think so.
Power and economic power in the industry?
I don't think so. I think as Twilight was saying, they're different products, and so what?
But if this is aimed toward the mass market fast food, and yes, the people on the coast can have their grass-fed burgers, grass-fed beef if they continue to eat meat, which is questionable in a hot world. But isn't that just going to consolidate power when Cargill can have its own factories? They don't need ranchers when they own the factories producing this meat.
Yeah, and I think it's creating a lot of concern for stakeholders in those conventional meat industries. I will say that a month after I reported in Bloomberg on Tyson's decision to get into alternative meats, Tom Hayes, the CEO, resigned. And I'm not saying that it was because of the piece, but it's a tough time. The meat industry's been going through all kinds of price instability related to tariffs and other things. But it's a tough time to be talking about self-disruption in an industry that's been sort of a bit volatile. And I think that there's a lot of concern about how it's managed and what it means to control have ownership over cells that are grown and all this stuff. I mean, there are many unanswered questions and risks, and the way that the oversight and the way in which environmental activists and policymakers shepherd the growth of these industries and make sure that we do this in the right way is essential. But yeah, they're big questions.
In Twilight Greenaway, do we even know the life cycle analysis of lab meat? Is it really less greenhouse gases to produce, fake meat than real meat?
Great question. I haven't seen that yet, and I don't think it's out. I mean, we do have some life cycle analysis for plant-based meat. There's been a lot of discussion around that lately. There's also been some new life cycle analysis around pasture that's come out in the last few weeks. They're both from the same third-party organization, Qantas, I think it's called. Neither are peer-reviewed. So there's a lot of fast talk at this moment, but I'm glad you brought up ownership, because I feel like, there were a lot of great things about your book, and one of the questions that kept coming up for me was about the role of technology and what that technology ultimately does. Is it going to feed the system that we have, which is very top-down? A few companies own the bulk of it, whether we're talking seeds, whether we're talking pesticides, whether we're talking meat. And so many of these startups, their goal is to sell to these big companies, as you mentioned, with Blue River, for instance. But I think it's fairly common that that's the business model. So are they feeding into this system that is extremely top-down, or will there be technology that comes along? And I do think there probably is some now, but will there be some that really can feed into a more democratic food system that allows for different types of ownership, less concentrated ownership? And that's my big question.
Amanda?
Well, just to sort of give some context to that question, so the Blue River story is really interesting because this is AI, robotic technology.
Explain what Blue River is.
Okay. Blue River Technologies is a company based in Sunnyvale, California, and it's a block from Yahoo. It's a AI robotic company that has developed a way of deploying herbicide with sniper-like precision, so that this sort of system of cameras attached to the back of a tractor can identify and distinguish between crops and weeds. When the weeds are very young, can deploy a concentrated fertilizer or herbicide, kill the weed, protect the crop, keep the chemicals off the crop, as an alternative to broadcast spraying, which we've seen with Roundup Ready and so on. There's huge amounts of herbicides that are saturating crops and creating all kinds of concern about the public health impacts of those chemicals. It's a really exciting technology, in part because this maiden voyage of the early tests of these robots, they've seen 90% reduction in herbicide applications on the fields in which they're used. They also hope to apply this to fungicides, insecticides, and eventually fertilizers. And what it means is plant-by-plant farming rather than field-by-field farming, so potentially bringing in intercropping and more diversity into fields. When the intelligent machines can manage the plants individually, you can potentially move beyond monocropping. So all this is great. It's elevating the principles of sustainable farming and bringing them into large-scale food production. It would all be great. I think it was last September, Blue River, I think 3 or 4 years into its existence, was sold to John Deere for $305 million. And the CEO, I remember, was in the midst of reporting this story, and I talked to Jorge Herod, who's the CEO, and I said, "What? You're selling to John Deere, one of the oldest brands in ag. This is, part of this trend that's so concerning to so many of us." And he basically said, we need to scale. We need to get these machines into the field. We need to produce them in a really sound and reliable way. This can get our robots into 10,000 distributors globally. Like, this needs to happen. And the result is disruption of ag chemicals and the ag chemical industries. And so we need the scale. We need the sort of good guys and bad guys to collaborate, right? It doesn't mean that is disrupting the rise of local food webs and farmers markets and CSAs and locally sourced foods. It means maybe this is a way of bringing more intelligent practices to industrial ag. So I don't know. I mean, I don't know that they're necessarily at odds with each other. That make improving practices in industrial agriculture inherently threatens the growth, the diversification that's happening in local food webs. But it's, again, really concerning, because if you have very expensive, intelligent robots on farms that farmers don't know how to fix, that can break down, that can be hacked,
aren't allowed to fix,
and maybe aren't allowed to fix, right? So yeah,
it's John Deere.
It's again this interesting challenge of sort of risk benefit, but certainly the potential benefit of bringing intercropping to large scale agriculture is, I think, important enough that for me it was exciting to get inside there, see how it worked, what it could become. Again, it has to be tightly, regulated and observed, and that's a discussion that needs to happen.
And you write about See and Spray, another robotic weed killer, and Potato, which is thinning lettuce to allow certain lettuces, the stronger lettuce, thrive and survive, and killing the weaker lettuce. In your chapter called RoboCrop. But Twilight, let's have your take on robots on the farm, whether that's going to kind of robots are going to kill monoculture, or is it they're going to do something else?
Well, I mean, we're moving towards automation in so many ways culturally, and I do think that it's happening in food, absolutely. I mean, I'm seeing it, we're seeing it, and it's really right there on the horizon. But I mean, it's already the $250,000 John Deere that I rode in a combine a year and a half ago. I got to sit there in an air-conditioned space, and the farmer let me drive it just around the corner and into this giant parking space he'd built in a barn. And, he could watch a sitcom while he runs through the fields. And it's a very different experience, I think, than what most people think of as farming. So I do think there's already been a fair amount of technology in play. And
is that sad? Is that a loss for you?
I think it's complicated. I mean, I don't think that I'm as diametrically opposed to Amanda's take as it may seem. I think that, you brought up diversity, and I think, rural communities are already emptying out. They've already been emptying out. And that technology has played a serious role in that and will continue to. And has been a big focus of mine recently, is trying to figure out, what would it take to bring more people back to these places. And when I went to Iowa and spent time with a really wonderful innovator named Sarah Carlson, who's working with farmers, conventional and organic, all across the Iowa landscape to bring about diversity, as she put it, just to give people permission to plant other things. Because in this part of the country, as I'm sure you know, corn and soy is it. And there are a lot of farms that are corn on corn on corn. They've even cut out the idea of a 2-crop rotation. And so spending time with her was very enlightening for me as a Bay Area, food world person. And she, at one point when we met the first time, she really leaned over and was like, this is really about bringing people back. This is my community, She talked to me about how her high school had consolidated with another high school when she was younger, and how, the hospitals in her area had consolidated or shut down, how there is this whole world there that's changed for the worse for the most part. And diversity, as she sees it, and I was pretty convinced by the end of my time with her, bringing back diversity to crops and bringing animals onto farms and bringing cover crops and small grains, and essentially shifting the marketplace so that we don't just get corn from one place, oats are in Canada. If we could bring oats back to Iowa, for instance, it would be huge, because you could get a 3-crop rotation going. It would actually require a little more labor, which might bring back a second generation of farmers. So I'm interested in solutions like that as much as I am interested in technology. And Yeah.
And Amanda Little, you write that 2% of people in America are involved in, producing food from land. There needs to be more. Is the industrialization and kind of introduction of robots going to bring more people back to producing food, or is that going to reduce the number of people producing food?
Well, great question. I mean, the definition of farmer is definitely expanding. A lot of the people working in the ag space are not hands in the dirt people. They're IT folks, they're mechanical engineers, electrical engineers. It's a much broader definition, and that's both exciting and concerning. It's certainly exciting to a lot of young people that I interviewed who are coming into the ag space because they're interested in, engineering and, whatever it is, drones, sensors, smart farms, all these things that are, post-organic or, have great potential benefits to human health and the environment, but it's not dirt, hands in the dirt. I don't think, though, I think that there's going to be so much demand from all of us who continue to want to support local farms, who continue to want to see diversity in the farmscape, that we're not going to all go to this sci-fi future of robots farming food. I think that there's a double whammy challenge. One is to address and redress all the problems of existing in industrial agriculture, and there are so many. The second challenge is to begin to prepare for and maybe even preempt a lot of the population and environmental pressures that are coming down the line. So, the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, has predicted that we'll see a 2 to 6% decline in global crop yields every decade going forward because of climate pressures. We also hear from, the UN that we're going to 9.5 billion people by mid-century, right? So that paradox of increasing demand and declining supply presents a real problem. Some of these solutions can potentially do both, can help redress the existing problems in industrial agriculture, make it smarter and better and more nimble, and while also sort of beginning to sort of prepare for some of these increasing climate pressures. But I don't think that it's sort of one or the other. It's like, are we going to do sustainable, local, organic, small-scale agriculture, or are we going to do? Is it all going to be robots and industrial food production? It's got to be both, and to present it as sort of one or the other, I think, is misleading, and I think we totally agree on that.
You write, Amanda Little, in your book about local is not always better. There's barramundi from Vietnam. Tell us how you think that actually, that fish frozen and flown in from Vietnam is better than local fish.
The aquaculture story is really interesting because there's so many challenges with producing, farmed fish in an environmentally sensitive way. One of the fish farmers profiled in Dan Barber's book, Third Plate, I believe it is, Josh Goldman, produces barramundi. His company is Australis. You may have seen this Love the Wild is a brand that has supporting sustainable aquaculture, and barramundi is one of the fish in there. So these are sort of brands you may be becoming familiar with. Goldman founded his company in Turners Fall, Massachusetts. He did on-land farming of barramundi, which is this flaky white fish native to parts of Southeast Asia and Australia, and it's a bit smaller than a salmon, but he basically was getting a lot of attention for doing this well without the problems of polluting marine ecosystems and so on. What he found was that the water inputs and the energy inputs into managing on-land aquaculture were so difficult for him to manage that when he produced and farmed the fish in the native habitat and then froze it, put it on a ship and brought it back to his consumers, and mostly in the U.S., that it was better for him from a cost standpoint, better from the product standpoint, and basically lower carbon inputs, because what it took for him to maintain all the pumps, the climate of this aquaculture system locally was far more than, from a climate, far less far more climate intensive than putting it on a ship and getting it from Southeast Asia to the U.S. So he was surprised by that outcome, right? That was going to, have environmental advantages over the sort of local fish production on land. And it's, we've heard some of that about, local production of, for example, hothouse tomatoes, sometimes is more energy intensive than, trucking a tomato from, over longer distances. But certainly, if you can do local farming with, out a lot of energy inputs and, climate-controlled environments, there's huge environmental and health advantages to that. In aquaculture, it's a little tricky because it takes a lot.
If you're just joining us, we're talking about the future of food with two authors, Amanda Little and Twilight Greenaway from Civil Eats. I'm Greg Dalton. About a decade ago, fruit breeders in Florida noticed that the state's peach on schedule. They looked into historical data since the 1970s and found that some peach varieties were blooming earlier and earlier, others later and later. The culprit, climate change. Jose Chaparro is a professor of horticultural sciences at the University of Florida in Gainesville. He's in charge of their fruit tree breeding program. We spoke to him about the approach they took to hedge their bets against future climate fluctuations.
What we have noticed is that our highest chill peaches, the varieties that require in excess of 350 chill hours, were blooming later, and that we were having problems having a consistent yield, and that the lower chill varieties that only required 150 chill hours, what would be considered to be a subtropical peach, were actually blooming earlier and earlier. In terms of breeding, what we have decided to do is that we've decided to straddle the chilling requirement of north central Florida, and we've established two satellite programs, one in Attapulgos, Georgia, 3 hours northwest of Gainesville, and then we've established a satellite program in Fort Pierce where we barely get 75 chill hours, with the idea that regardless of where the trends head long term, we're selecting germplasm that's divergent and capable of adaptation to different zones. Maybe the optimal location will no longer be in Florida, it'll be in Georgia, or maybe the coastal plain of North Carolina, but there will be other crops like citrus that will expand north. Maybe avocado production in Florida. So there'll be opportunities. Other people in other regions of the world are going to need improved high-yielding varieties in order to have viable agriculture. We have to focus. We have to select for adaptation. We have to take advantage of the genetic diversity that exists in nature and just forge ahead.
In Gainesville. Twilight Greenaway, there's a couple things in there. One is hedging bets. Maybe Florida, maybe Georgia, maybe North Carolina, which again gets to kind of the scale. You have to have some scale and money to do that. And the other part of that is just the adaptation. Well, if we can't grow this, we can't grow oranges, we'll grow avocados. So talk to me about the resilience and adaptation part that professor's getting to.
Well, I think I mentioned to you when we spoke earlier that I grew up on a farm, and my mother, who still farms in Hawaii, is seeing a lot of what he's talking about there on the screen. It's
a coffee farm.
Mm-hmm. It's a coffee farm, but she's also seen all kinds of fruit trees that she planted when she first moved to the property 25 years ago, making fruit like mangoes and coconuts that were coastal, much lower elevation fruit. Suddenly it's showing up further. She sort of planted them on a whim, and now they're fruiting. So that's happened within my lifetime, and I feel like it's a pretty clear message that things are moving fast. I mean, I actually wanted to speak more about the local issue, if that's possible, because we started to get into it, and I think
Sure.
I think that the I lost my train of thought for a minute.
Can you, while you're getting it back,
sure.
I just wanted to add,
on his, so the idea there, he basically says, well, we can adapt. If we can't grow this, we'll grow this, and certain crops will go northward. It seems like a manageable change in what grows where, rather than oh my gosh, we're not going to be able to feed the world kind of.
some of what Chaparro and other agronomists are looking at is how do you think about breeding plants with resilience so they can continue to grow in the regions where they have grown for so long, right? So some of his research is adapting peach and citrus plants to survive the new normal, as he said, right? So can we continue having the same peaches we know and love, but with new properties like drought tolerance, insect resistance for migrating insect populations, heat tolerance, frost tolerance, and this is one of the areas of focus on breeding. I interviewed a farmer in a very different region of Wisconsin, actually. Cherry farmers and apple farmers in the Midwest have been dealing with seasonal shifts that have been causing all kinds of premature blooming, and then what they call total kill events, where a frost will come in April or May at a normal time, the tree will have fully fruited, and then, in this case of this one farmer who has about 300 acres of apple trees, he had total kill. So he lost more than $1 million in harvest in 2 hours of freeze over one night in early May. And he had then begun to install frost fans, which are these fans that bring warm layers of air down into, from above into the sort of lower areas where the trees are growing, which was, many tens of thousands of dollars of investment. There were some farmers who were bringing in helicopters to push down this layer of warm air to try to protect these trees from freeze.
What's the carbon impact of all
yeah,
that?
exactly. Right. I know. It's like we're trying to mix up this atmosphere in order to deal with these major atmospheric shifts. And it was, totally chilling, and pun intended, to see what is happening on the ground. These adaptation efforts. When you can't pick up and move a tree that's been in the ground for 10, 20 years, it's very hard to say let's just shift north or shift the region. I mean, it's hanging on to this multi-generation farm and don't want to start growing avocados or whatever. So part of it is how do you sort of address the breeding challenges of building resilience into the plants, and part of it is do we see the regions where plants are grown shifting, and this is particularly true. And I mean, I researched this in areas of Western Africa where they're having really serious difficulty growing some indigenous crops because of environmental pressures. And again, some of the scientists there are basically saying, we want to continue growing heirloom and indigenous crops, but we have to use modern technologies to find ways to build resilience into these crops. So again, it was sort of confounding some of these questions about what's local and traditional and indigenous and what's survivable in the climate era.
And here in California, a big question is water. There are all kinds of crops that are water intensive that we're still growing. We're still growing hay, we're still growing rice. There are areas and crops that just won't make sense for very much longer. And there's a lot of discussion about fallowing, which is pretty real. I worked on a story recently about a pilot program that happened in the Colorado River Basin, where they actually paid farmers to fallow portions of their land as an experiment to see if they could get water to flow back to Lake Mead and Lake Powell. So that discussion's happening.
And the area of research known as drought tolerance, and how can plants learn from there are certainly strains of certain coffee plants, for example, that are more drought tolerant than others, right? What can we learn from the ways that plants have adapted over many millennia to harsh climate conditions, and bring some of those plants back online now? Will it require some sort of genetic editing or engineering to bring properties from more resilient and adaptive plants into the crops that we have come to know and love? So it's a really interesting area, and drought tolerance is one of the big mysteries in crop science. I did not realize this, but it's for decades there have been research into how much water does a crop need at a certain point. How do you teach a plant to, become sort of, as some plants do, resurrection plants, to sort of hibernate during drought periods and then sort of spring back to life? Can you teach crops to do this? I mean, it's really interesting and very, very difficult to answer some of these questions. But again, lots of research activity on these questions.
We've been talking a lot about food. I want to talk about some people. Twilight Greenaway, you wrote about Victor Gutierrez, who's a 30-year-old farm worker in the Central Valley of California. So tell us his story.
Sure. So I worked on a unfortunate story recently about a soil-borne illness called valley fever that's been around in California and in the Southwest for over 100 years. But the increase in dust storms, climate-fueled dust storms, it's gone up something like 240% in the Southwest. And what that means is everyone in the Southwest is at increased risk for this soil-borne. It's a fungus that once it gets into your lungs, if you have a really healthy immune system, most people can fight it off, or it might turn into a cold or a flu. But anyone who's at all immune compromised is at risk, really. And in fact, sometimes people who aren't even particularly immune compromised seem to get it. So I wrote about Victor Gutierrez and a few other farm workers and farm worker advocates who are really facing the problem head on, because they face all different kinds of other challenges that can impact the immune system, from living in food deserts. Ironically, the Central Valley is a really significant food desert, to lack of clean water, also very tied to agriculture due to nitrogen use and stress and other factors, essentially, as I came to see it over the course of researching this piece, put farm workers at greater risk, as do the fact that they have less access to healthcare, the fact that they're often living in poverty. So it's a deep irony that the folks who are growing our food face some of the biggest risks related to climate change, not just valley fever, but also heat stress and other illnesses caused by long-term exposure to heat. So
It's a big deal. In 2011, you wrote that the estimated health costs in California of more than $2 billion to treat valley fever. So this is big money and something that is climate related and often not recognized as a climate impact. But that's a lot of money. I want to talk also about carbon farming. We'd be remiss, we haven't talked a lot about soil yet so far. Carbon farming, the idea that to kind of put carbon back in the soil. We basically, the last couple hundred years, we've taken carbon out of the ground, burned it, smoked it, put it up in the air. Now the idea is to put it back in the form of plants and roots stored in the soil. So either one of you can tell me about carbon farming as one of the real bright spots, potentially, if it can scale in the climate equation.
Well, one of the many areas of carbon farming that I looked at or am particularly interested in is no-till, and how
no-till agriculture.
No-till agriculture.
Okay.
So the idea is that instead of plowing up the soil every season, you're leaving the crops in ground. You're actually letting the agricultural remnants of that crop decompose back into the soil, create sort of a carpet on top of the soil, planting right into that carpet of old, crop matter, and using and keeping the soil intact, and all of the microbiome in that soil and the insects and so forth in that soil intact. The challenge has been that it's very herbicide intensive, because you get a lot of weeds that like to grow up in the no-till zones. And actually, this is one of the interests for the AI robotics folks, that, if we can be very targeted in the way that herbicides are used to address the weed problems in no-till farming, it could really dramatically expand the use of no-till across the board. It's pretty amazing how little expansion there has been of no-till, given how much of an advantage it is from a carbon sequestration standpoint, but also irrigation, because the tilling brings so much moisture out of the soil. It's really more and more costly for farmers to replenish that moisture. So it saves quite a bit of money from a water standpoint, irrigation standpoint, and again, from a soil health standpoint and, fertilizer input standpoint. But it's not growing very quickly, because it doesn't, the look is nice. It's just a departure from for a lot of farmers from the way they've been doing things. But to find ways of incentivizing no-till, of helping to grow that particular practice, among other carbon sequestration practices, is a huge and hugely important area of focus. And if we can do it in ways that are much less herbicide intensive, then it's a no-brainer.
Twilight Greenaway, North Face has sold a Cali wool beanie that they said was climate beneficial. So the idea is that this can actually help the climate. So tell us about some of the climate beneficial or carbon farming, and as well as
Sure.
efforts in California on healthy soils.
Sure. I mean, I also spent some time with some no-till guys. I went to a conference where there were hundreds of no-till guys. And when they do it in concert with other practices, I do think they are often able to bring down the pesticide use as well. When they do it in this kind of regenerative way that brings animals in, that brings cover crops in. But California, yes. So California has definitely been a leader, and it's exciting because there are 39 other states. California has a healthy soils initiative. They've recently just upped the funding for fairly dramatically, and there are 39 other states where there are healthy soil initiatives coming up. So that is, for me, a really significant positive step. In terms of the beanie, the wool, I worked on a story about an effort to recognize certain practices on farms in California, and there's an effort to bring particularly people who are doing fiber-related farming and livestock that way, but also meat and dairy, and to really reward them and fund certain efforts. Like, for instance, I know you've had the Marin Carbon Project on as well, but to bring compost at a thin layer across some of this agricultural land, whether it's for grazing or otherwise, has been shown to be able to really make a significant difference in terms of carbon drawdown into the soil. So that's encouraging, but there really hasn't been enough money put into it yet, and that was what I found when I wrote about it. That they keep bumping it up. Gavin Newsom, I think the most recent number I saw might have been 24 million. Don't quote me on that. But
a lot of money, but still small
it's a drop
potatoes.
in the bucket, because that's a few farms, a few loads of compost. Like it goes really fast. So what really, in theory, what needs to happen is a much larger scale.
One very quick add-on is that there's a lot of unused farmland. Identifying what farmland is unused, reforesting some of that farmland if possible, bringing trees into agriculture as a part of a carbon sink strategy is a huge opportunity.
And that is one of the practices that they're incentivizing here in California, not only along waterways, creating carbon sinks on waterways, but bringing in more silvopasture, which I think as you've written about, I think is one of the most encouraging possibilities out there.
Amanda Little, before we go to audience questions, I want to ask about some foods that we don't hear a lot about that we may be learning more about in the future as we go into a world of, a hot world of 9 billion people. So there's kernza, which you've written about. Is it moringa, which can, is sometimes called famine food. There's cassava, perennials that have all sorts of attributes that can be good sources of carbohydrates. I think most people haven't heard about cassava, moringa, or kernza. So tell us about some of these foods that might be coming a bigger role in the future.
Yeah, so the book is a sort of 5-year adventure into the lands and minds and machines working on the future of food. Some of that is very high tech, and some of it is some of those efforts are really focused on restoring ancient practices and traditional practices of farming. And, I looked at edible insects, which are, consumed in many cultures today and have been for thousands of years, and ancient plants and what we can learn from them, and the research that's going into bringing some very nutrient-dense ancient plants back online. That chapter starts out in Mexico with a farmer who is researching moringa. You probably have heard about moringa because it has a lot of traction in health food circles, and has incredible nutrient properties, and it's very drought resilient. The tree is almost sort of Dr. Seussian in its many benefits and sort of capabilities, both nutritionally and environmentally. But it's not, it hasn't really been picked up in sort of modern food circles beyond, very kind of specific niche areas. So this scientist is working on, making it easier to grow this food, making it easier to harvest it, and sort of expanding the access to moringa, particularly in dry tropical regions where the plant, is native to equatorial nations, and so it's an interesting area of focus. Kernza is another area where with this plant that has very, very deep roots, that's able to, has inherent drought resilience because it's able to tap water supply very deep in the soil. Again, it's not as productive as modern wheat by a long shot. So a lot of the breeding research is going into how can we bring sort of the drought resilience properties of this plant, online in a bigger way by, making it easier to produce. I think it's, a quarter or a third of the actual sort of productivity of modern wheat. But again, has so many useful and important sort of attributes that it's very relevant to the discussion of climate resilient food sources. Quinoa is another ancient plant there's a lot of interesting research around how to make that adaptable to new environments for farming. But this is even algae and duckweeds, and there are all these kinds of interesting areas of focus right now. How much of it will really become accessible to broader populations? Will we be able to feed more people with less food because it's more nutrient dense? Really interesting and important questions. Again, it's really sort of research stage right now, but helps sort of inform the bigger conversation.
I want to go to a lightning round and ask you some quick questions. I'm going to mention a food and ask you to say the first thing that comes to your mind with unfiltered, the first thing that comes to your mind. Twilight Greenaway, tofu. First thing, you've already thought of it.
Tofu has had this kind of interesting history. I think people have really strong feelings about it either way.
One word or phrase, okay. Amanda Little, GMO corn.
Yes. It is necessary on some level if it has the right genes.
Twilight Greenaway, almond milk.
Water intensive, but not as much as dairy.
Amanda Little, your favorite food cooked by your mother or father?
4-cheese lasagna.
Twilight Greenaway, your least favorite food cooked by your mother or father?
Oh, steamed vegetables and brown rice.
Also, Twilight Greenaway, your guilty food pleasure?
Lamb. I love it. I eat it about once a month because I know the carbon impact.
Amanda Little, your least favorite cuisine?
I love it all. I really don't. There's no food I don't love.
The answer of a food writer. Twilight Greenaway, your favorite cuisine?
California.
Amanda Little, your food habit you'd most like to change?
Meat consumption. I have a very fraught love affair with meat. I have tried to be a vegan and a vegetarian and every version of that, and I keep going back to the barbecue.
Confessions of a barbecue lover. Okay. Twilight Greenaway, your food habit you'd most like to change?
Going to Costco.
All right, let's give them a round of applause for getting through the big Got it ready. If you're just joining us, Amanda Little is a professor of journalism at Vanderbilt University and writes for Bloomberg and The New Yorker. Her new book is The Fate of Food, What We'll Eat in a Bigger, Hotter, Smarter World. Twilight Greenaway is a contributing editor at Civil Eats, an online source of news about food, health, and environment. I'm Greg Dalton. We're going to go to our audience questions and invite you to come to the microphone back there with one comment or question. Crisp and brief is beautiful, and we'll get through as many of those as we can in the remaining minutes. And please briefly identify yourself, and you can address your question to either of our guests. So let's go to audience questions. Welcome to Climate One.
Hello, my name is Teresa. My question is, I do know some people that do farming, and the cost of agriculture now to enter farming, if you just buying acreage, is literally cost prohibitive. So how do we support local farming? How do we support these alternate types of farming when you have to be big business to just afford to be in it?
Twilight Greenaway, you told me about a film that's recently out that kind of tackles this. Some people who romantically tried to get into farming and realized how hard and expensive it was.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're at this pivotal moment where all these farmers are about to retire. And so that is a huge question, is what's going to happen? How are we going to support new and beginning farmers? How are we going to help more immigrant farmers who are coming over from other places with these amazing agricultural skills? I think that's really one of the biggest questions of our time when it comes to food and agriculture. And I think that the one thing we haven't tackled enough yet on this stage is policy. I mean, we need policy that supports farmers, and in particular new and beginning farmers, in a way that we just don't have at this point. There are little points of support in the Farm Bill, and on state levels. There's a really interesting model in Minnesota where they forgave student loans I don't think it's actually been implemented yet, but they voted to forgive student loans for young farmers. And I think we need more of those types of policies.
Let's go to our next question. Welcome to Climate One.
Yes, my name is John Knox, and I'm very curious about your thoughts about the landscape of certification systems, organic and others, as might be affected by the climate changes and other kinds of changes that farmers are needing to make.
Getting certified organic is expensive, and it can be a hurdle for some people. Who'd like to tackle that one?
I can. I mean, in terms of climate change, I think we're at this interesting point where a number of farmers are saying they don't think that certified organic is enough. And so there is this really interesting movement to try to go beyond organic. And there's a new regenerative organic label that's just come online for folks who want to show that they're doing more with soil health and more to regenerate the environment beyond beyond organic. I mean, there are many people who will argue that organic already does that, but because organic has really morphed and changed shape quite a lot in the last 19 years since the label was created, many would argue that there are quite a few really large companies, large operators in the business who care less about the regenerative piece.
This question whether organic can scale. There's a real debate about that, and I've even had people on the stage, women, running Google Foods, saying that some things that are pasture raised, they're on the land longer. That's there's more complicated than organic as this all-encompassing virtue.
Well, animal welfare hasn't been part of the organic standards in the way that a lot of people want. I mean, there's a pasture
or water.
rule.
Water use is not part of organic.
There was a huge push to bring animal welfare in a new way and it passed through some very important gauntlets at the end of the Obama administration, and then it was literally squashed the first year of the Trump administration.
Amanda?
Well, there's also, these areas that we don't know how to certify yet. Some of them are in, fruit and vegetable production, vertical farms that are coming up in, urban areas that, again, call their food production post-organic. They're not grown in soil or under sun. And it's, what is that exactly, and should it be labeled in one way or the other? And also, a huge area of focus is how to label alternative meats, and should they be allowed to be called meats, and how will we sort of regulate the labeling of those products? Again, no clear answers at the moment, but a big area of debate. And dairy, there's this emerging frontier of what they call flora-based dairy, which is fermented dairy. It's using yeast to pump out dairy proteins that's then built into dairy products that taste pretty indistinguishable. It's sort of like the cell-based meats of the dairy world, and alternative eggs, and that are sort of not from animals, but do we label them in the same way? How do we do that? Again,
It's very contentious.
it's very contentious. And do they get an extra humane stamp of approval for getting animals out of the process altogether? And water certainly is a big piece of big part of the argument for some of these, vertical farms, for example, can produce some foods with, 90% less water if it's misted rather than hydroponic. Do you get some sort of credit for that or not? And is there a label for water efficient fruit and vegetable production? Who knows?
Eating is getting complicated. Let's go to our next question. Welcome.
Hi, I'm Jessie. I'm a computer science student at Brown University. And my question is, in California, the agriculture and food and tech intersection scene is pretty prevalent. Like, there's plenty of food and agriculture tech startups. But how do you see these innovations becoming accessible in different parts of the world, especially to rural farmers in developing countries who don't have access to the resources that Californian or American farmers have, and who are especially vulnerable to climate change?
Amanda Little, you make a case for involvement of technology in agriculture. How about the accessibility of it?
It's a great question, and it's all about affordability and accessibility, which is part of why someone like Blue River would say, yes, working with scale and getting these technologies down in cost is a way of making them more and more accessible to lower income and smaller scale farmers. But I guess California has always been sort of applauded for its role in early adoption technologies. How quickly will it come down in cost, whether it's a robot or a lab meat? is, and how quickly will it be embraced, in terms of acceptance, and how, there are organizations like the Bill Gates Foundation and so on, and Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation that are trying to sort of bring bridge some of these technologies from, Silicon Valley to, regions in emerging economies, and that's very controversial. But it's a cost issue and it's an acceptance issue, and it's a tough call because you can't. It's not ever going to be all technology. We need technology and self-control at the same time. We need, behavior shifts. We need a shift in consciousness. We need to continue to support local food webs. We need to do it all. It isn't a matter of, technology will save the day, but it is a matter of, supporting the best technologies that can really, improve and address the problems of our time, and those that can be most useful to smallholder farmers and in farming communities around the world need to come down in cost. I mean, that's essentially the big challenge. And will that take 5 years or 10 years or more? Nobody yet knows.
Twilight Greenaway, are you suspicious still of the intrusion of tech into agriculture?
Am I suspicious?
Yeah.
Well, like I said earlier, I think there are some big questions at play, and I'm interested in seeing how it starts to or continues to play out. But that question about democracy and about and the role of policy, like I feel like there's some really interesting conversation brewing among some of the presidential candidates around antitrust in the agriculture sphere, and that to me is a really big important question, because if it really is going to just be 2 or 3 or 4 companies running the show, I really think the options are fewer.
That's actually an interesting point as we end here to think about, because I think Civil Leads did a post on kind of the agricultural policies of the presidential candidate. So what are some of the broad brush conclusions? That there obviously a lot of the early primary states are agricultural states, and going to Iowa, there's often a lot of pandering to corn and other things. So Twilight, what are some of the lines you're seeing with the campaign on ag?
Well, like I said, some talk of breaking up some of the large entities. I've seen that on the part of Sanders and Warren. There's really, once we started digging into it, there really is quite a range of different things that people have talked about, from what's happening in their own state to what could happen federally. What are some other examples? Obviously, ethanol is a huge topic, like you mentioned, in Iowa.
Right.
I mean, it's really quite a range. I would
spectrum.
say. Yeah, I mean, Warren had one of the most detailed. Warren and Sanders have probably had the most detailed policies so far.
Amanda Little, when we wrap up, I want to mention 3D printing of food, something I read about, perhaps for military rations. I mean, just explain to us, is this where we're going? 3D printing of food?
Yeah, it's been really interesting to me that of all the things that I write about in this book, 3D printed foods and eating lab meats are the two things that everybody wants to talk about. And it's a very sort of fringe, and far-flung area of research right now. But the short version is at the Natick Research Laboratory in Massachusetts, there are researchers developing or adapting 3D printers that generally work with polymers, depositing in sort of dots or lines, one layer after another to make shapes ranging from rubber duckies to functioning firearms. These particular researchers are trying to deposit in layers upon layers pastes of food paste. It could be a chickpea paste or an avocado paste or a sort of nut butter or something else into a nugget or a bar that is also mixed with specialized nutrients that can be, specific to the needs of a particular soldier. So soldier A has a potassium deficiency, soldier B has a vitamin C deficiency, soldier C has needs B12, whatever. And this they know from sensors that are testing the sweat and blood of the soldiers, sending this information wirelessly to the 3D printer, which then makes the bar or nugget of food with that certain cocktail concoction of nutrients that the soldier needs. It is that it's printed out, it's given to a drone, and then it's delivered into the field of combat, and there is the personalized food nugget. And so that seemed to me to be in sort of the category of like post-food future that was very hard for me to imagine inhabiting. Again, I'm a nostalgic eater, I have done, tried out Soylent and tried by hand at the adult baby formulas that are available on the market. But I much prefer, my mom's rib sticking 4-cheese lasagna. Food is a proxy for love for a lot of us. This is how, I relate to this topic. I'm not a great cook. I'm not a farmer. But I care about this issue because, as we all do, and we don't want to see our traditions and our sort of the rituals around food destroyed. And something like 3D printing, Soylent, etc., feels like a threat to that. The argument from many of the soldiers and scientists at the research laboratory was, hey, this is a lot better than an MRE. This is actually it's fresher, it's more nutrient dense, and it's going to be preferable to most of the soldiers in the field. And it was interesting watching this 3D printer named Foodini tried to print out a hummus flatbread with an avocado army star squirted on top of it. And the thing kept sort of malfunctioning and getting like clogs and trying to sort of purge the clogs. And I mean, it was like watching a toddler learn how to, how to, make sense of anything, really. It was like learning along the way. Actually, this is what was happening in the field with the robotic herbicide, the robotic weeder, was that it was sort of learning along the way. Again, it feels very strange and impossible to imagine that this is all a reality. It is, at least in the laboratories in the case of the 3D printed food. What I would like to say just with that question about, history or the sort of context, is it technology or not technology when we think about the future of food? And, historically over millennia, since essentially the first, farms, came to be, 10,000 BC, something around there. And the first plow was developed in, roughly 6,000 or 7,000 BC. This has been a story of, tools and techniques and new implemented technologies along the way. This is not a new story. It's an old story. We have been, the narrative of we're running out of food, we can't feed humanity is thousands of years old. And in part, the way we've moved through that story and moved through that process is by applying new tools and techniques and good judgment. And, so as we move through this phase, it's, I think, this notion that it's either we reinvent food or we de-invent food, that we, restore the past or we, hurtle into the future, is sort of a story of false opposites. It's going to be both. We have to move forward, seeing how we've misapplied technology in the past, and that may or may not involve 3D printed avocado flatbread. I hope not, but I know that a lot of what I end up eating, out of a plastic clamshell, is not very high nutrient or good for me or the environment. So there's a lot to fix, but for the most part, I'm very hopeful.
I'd like to invite you to join us at a reception outside in the lounge and enjoy some snacks from Buy Right and Gus's Community Market. Local local, we think local. They told us it was local. Amanda will sign some books. I'd like to invite you to participate in our photo or video for Let's Talk Climate. We have some signs out there, and you can take a photo of yourself, tweet it, put it on Instagram, just to get people to talk about climate change. I'd like to thank the Climate One crew. I have the pleasure and honor up here talking with fabulous writers and leaders. I'd like to thank Brian and Billy and James and Joe and Josh, Kelly, Spencer, Steve, and Tyler. Let's give them a round of applause for making today happen, because they do the work. We've been talking about the future of food in a hot and crowded world. Podcasts of this and other Climate One shows are available wherever you podcast. My guests have been Amanda Little, author of the new book, The Fate of Food, and Twilight Greenaway, editor at Civil Eats. Thanks for joining us. I'm Greg Dalton. We'll see you next time, everybody.
Hey, do you have a phone on you?